had this friend once, and the short time I knew him, we had very different political perspectives. And he was kind of interested in getting to know about mine, and I was kind of interested in getting to know about his. But I gotta be honest with you, I didn't quite get it. So I've been trying to figure out, he's been heavy on my conscience here. And I'm not exactly sure what he's doing these days. But I think there's been some misrepresentation about who he was and what he stood for. And I think that this has been used in acts of slander. So I want to try to get correct what is being communicated here. And if I'm correct, then the understanding of syndicalism in its early onset, from what was encountered, attempted to define it and articulate it as an understanding of propaganda by deed. Now, propaganda is not necessarily a bad thing. Back in the day, propaganda was effective and understood to be instrumental in organizing, as well as attempting to engage elements into the public realm that allowed for articulation of certain points of view that could also be used to organize people. And sometimes it was provocative, but oftentimes it was educational. This is one of the things that the early days of learning to read and write in the United States, the early days of the press, were about people with a variety of different contexts engaging around political education and learning basic primary reading skills, writing skills based on publications, including ones that presented opinions and sometimes provocative opinions, right? So propaganda by and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. But the concept of propaganda by deed, the understanding of actually engaging in action that is supposed to have a determinate impact, and in the course of engaging that action also demonstrates a kind of praxis. You engage certain actions, you act in certain ways, not only as a demonstration of what it is you're seeking and or what you consider to be an appropriate manner of engaging, but also in the process of construction and creation. These certain comportments are things that you do, and you also expect either a reaction or accommodation from somebody else. This makes sense. And I've done my own way of articulating this. I wrote something in 2016, and it did not speak of it specifically from a secular perspective. It was actually citing scripture, or rather, it was citing canonical text of the New Testament, the particular kind of Christian New Testament concept of the manifestation of faith through works, the understanding of engaging deeds in a conjunction with an understanding of one's faith, and then the realization of the work and the concept of engaging works with other people as a form of communion, and this kind of communion as a manner to establish a way of being that is kind of foundational for discussing matters related to ethos or even concepts around political paradigms, including what an organizing effort is and how to engage it. These things, despite coming from one being secular and one being from a more faith-based perspective, don't seem dissimilar. They don't even seem contrary. And even engaging in things that are controversial or that challenge what's considered to be the predominantly accepted protocol at the time, if there is an intention, and the intention and the provocation are aimed at creating a disturbance that one is willing to take responsibility and follow through on, well, this is how the history of political change has occurred. So, in and of itself, this is not a problem. But then the problem becomes the next level of the understanding of engaging acts of obstruction and or engaging acts of sabotage with an intention to disrupt an ongoing process, including a process one does not feel is ethical or moral, or that at its very base level serves the self-interest of those involved. It is not to my advantage to participate in this, and as a matter of fact, its success is predicated upon my destruction, or is in occurrence with or concurrence with processes seeked at destroying me, my rights, or my community, up to and including my nation state. Because these are not things that are necessarily in polarity to each other. And appealing to the higher values of a spiritual tradition, including one that teaches selflessness or that values service or even submission to a higher power. And also discussing things from a perspective of very blatant self interest, especially if one understands oneself to be connected to an ethos. These are not necessarily contrary. And so you can discuss these things and respect them on their face. This is how I feel about it. The problem then becomes, well, if you are engaged in these processes of provocation, then what is the aim? What is the objective? Engaging sabotage or disruption is a tactic. It can have potential utility. And even if you're engaging in sabotage of a process, for instance, that I would prefer, if there is an intention or in of itself a process whereby one demonstrates a kind of responsibility that is otherwise lacking anyhow, this isn't necessarily a calamity as far as I'm concerned. Would there have been a preference for another manner of engagement? Perhaps. But sometimes it's necessary to take that provocative step. The question is, what is the aim? If you have a problem with a pre-existing process because you understand that you are disenfranchised or disempowered from participation, then the question becomes one of how to participate in processes of gaining empowerment or acquiring that franchisement that has been dispossessed of you. But if it is about the destruction of the system, then why? And what do you intend to have supplanted? See, this is what I understood about this concept of propaganda through deed. You're doing something not just to engage a process of recruitment or trying to obtain resources from someone else. You're doing it in an act of creation with the intention to supplant. So what are you creating? If you're engaging in processes of disrupting another paradigm, then what and how you do that creates another kind of paradigm. If you're seeking merely to supplant one elitist tendency or bureaucratic apparatus that's based on particular demonstrations of loyalty or acts of humiliation in order to maintain a particular pecking order, that is merely going to supplant what you've identified as being a competing paradigm around that kind of systematology, there's really no use for this. And then we get into matters of criminality and senselessness. But if you're truly seeking to create an alternative and engaging in the process of creating that alternative, then the question becomes, well, how distinct and how different is what you're creating and in what manner you engage it so distinct that it necessitates the destruction of that which you confront. If you are talking about a system that has been mired and saturated with corruption to the point where it is no longer sustainable and it is actually become a destructive force in the world or your life, this is one manner of seeing it. But if you do not have an alternative to supplant it, then you haven't done the job. You haven't done the job of justifying its annihilation. So then we get into this other element, and this is what I am seeing now. And I understand I'm being subjected to it in some ways myself, but you got to call it out as you see it. In the processes of provocation and creating these disturbances, sometimes there are repercussions that are detrimental to some manners, but there are also possibilities that are created. And these possibilities for creation, especially if they're aimed at targeting or attempting to compel some conciliation from a opposition target, can draw the attention of other factors, can draw the attention of other factions and other ways of being that might not necessarily agree with you or even ally with you in matters of having shared principle, but can avail themselves opportunistically of advantage by leveraging their capacity to engage with and around the paradigmatic experience you're engaged in order to target a common enemy momentarily. including a common enemy that may not actually present as much as an existential challenge or contestation to your way of being and your intention as that which is attempting to exploit you while you focus on that one. This is happening on a very large level. This is part of how imperialism, in its very significant and advanced stages, works. It's, the big shortcoming of war by proxy, of anything by proxy. This is not necessarily that you've engaged in an agreement to provide a role of, or to seek to have someone provide the role of an actual safeguard or an actual proxy. Somebody that understands what it means to be in the seat of, or to be in the stead of somebody, because you are representing their interest, even if they're not your own. So you give the best representation as authentically as possible to that which you are representing in the moment. This is not what I'm talking about. This understanding of representation by proxy or engagement via proxy is not what, by and large, is the experience, especially in situations of war. This is part of why there is an intentional refusal to identify and confirm and acquire the formal consent, permissions, and support of those whom are operating via proxy, or those who are the proxies for those who are supposed to be held responsible, or whose fate is reliant upon the performance of someone in proxy, right? And these are the moments of hyper exploitation. And in the course of that hyper exploitation, efforts to try to challenge the status quo, either in order to seek its destruction so as to supplant it with something that is more beneficial, or to challenge it in terms of attempting to eliminate a corruption or a vice within that milieu so that then it can be recovered and reformed. These things are, by and large, exploited from without. And so the failure to identify and authentically acknowledge one's actual self-interest, I understand, is the greatest problem we're having. There's nothing wrong on its most basic level with saying who and what you understand you stand for and what your interest in. Without these initial acknowledgments of our own humanity and our own determination to move forward, we don't really have the initial support. We don't have the initial legitimacy to build anything. What we have potentially is a process whereby we take the stead of somebody else who does. And then without the actual self-interest or the investment of our self-interest, well, we don't have an inclination to accountability. And then we get into the question of destruction for the sake of destruction, or destruction as an act of removing an obstacle to that which is actually beneficial and that which has been demonstrated to be able to endure, including in consideration of efforts at self-criticism or at efforts at external criticisms that are aimed at trying to figure out a manner of engagement that allows for matching or that allows for complementarity as a possibility, as opposed to continuous confrontation and contestation. Compulsive confrontation ultimately serves the purposes of those who refuse to identify themselves and place their self-interest in the primary position of their engagement. This is the essence of representation. You can represent people that aren't necessarily like you. This is possible, but you can't do it authentically unless you are honest with them about where your self-interest lies in coming together with their self-interest. And if we don't allow for the creation of societies where people feel like it is okay to be honest and authentic with who they are, without allowing for that to merely be made into a commodity or a commercial product that somebody else claims as their product line, and we're in a very difficult situation where we don't have the capacity for creation. And this is ultimately what I understand allows for the corrupt to have its power. Corruption is allowed to maintain power because those who assume the positions of power in a corrupt apparatus do so in the stead of actual political legitimacy. Unfortunately, like it or not, whether you're from the right or you're from the left, most of the history of political struggle of the 20th century was about that very fact. The originators, the ones who created, the producers, were ultimately, by and large, not the ones accorded the understanding of the leadership within the paradigms in which they operated. The organic movements and the organic leadership ultimately was eliminated for a preferencing and prioritization of a particular kind of personality that could endure with an understanding others were to project themselves into a relativistic examination of selfhood based upon a reflection in or as that particular personality. How much of that was constructed as part of the processes of intentional alienation from our political capital development is a good question. But in the actual meantime, the actual processes of moving forward, it's important to understand. When you're in isolation like I am, and you don't really have anybody else to talk to, the constant effort to condition you behaviorally, to acclimate your behavior to creating a presentation that then gets you awarded, provided with the permission to actually do basic things like have conversations because you've demonstrated some form of, I don't even know, right? I don't have that kind of reflection. But what I understand is we're in this situation now where a lot of the alienation is coming back to roost. And so the question becomes, if we're going to continue this process of destruction, what is going to supplant it? The parody, the performance of the mockery, the intentional sabotatory efforts because of some sort of justification of engaging a effort to compel people to cooperate with a paradigm shift haven't provided an actual alternative. And so there's no incentive to transform. There's no incentive to bounce back in a different comportment. There's no incentive because there's no authenticity. And so there's nowhere to go. There's somewhere to go. There are places to go. But if there's no other self, then all I can do is continue to be myself in understanding these things. So I say this because we're in a situation where there's a very significant surreality going on, and I'm trying to be honest with these things as they come up. I am not interested in pageantry. I'm never going to be able to give you that. It doesn't matter what the underlying is, and it doesn't matter what the characterization of the currency is. I have absolutely no interest in performing a part or engaging in a scenario as a reflection or refraction of a stereotype. And so we're in a situation where I am providing what I can and I'm affirming what I can in order to acknowledge what it is that's being sought. But if you don't tell me who you are and you don't tell me where you stand, then all I can understand is that you do not belong in the position you're in the stead of someone who will. And we have too many people that won't say who they are and what they're doing, where they are. I'm just saying, the government does not have a right to say that we need to be confidential about our own existence. And if they're trying to do that, they're not the government, they're something else.